He looked her up and down like she was something he'd ordered by mistake. Not quickly, not privately. Right there on the main street of Red Hollow, with half the town watching, Edwin Bart let his eyes travel from her face to her waist to her shoes and back up again. And then he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "This ain't what I agreed to." Naomi Calloway didn't move. She couldn't. 3 states. She had crossed 3 states for this man. "You're bigger than your letter said." A woman near the general store covered her mouth. Someone laughed. Just one person. Just once. But it was enough. If you have ever stood in front of a crowd and felt the ground disappear beneath you, then you already know exactly what Naomi felt in that moment. And if you've ever been judged for something you cannot change, your size, your age, your face, then this story was made for you. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Hollow, 1886, and meet the woman who changed everything. So, the wagon that brought Naomi Calloway into Red Hollow arrived at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning in July, and the heat was the kind that made the air shimmer above the dirt road like something alive and hostile. She had been riding since before dawn, wedged between a crate of canned goods and a sack of feed grain because the stage line had been full, and the supply wagon was the only option. Her dress, the blue one she had saved for this occasion, the one she'd pressed twice and hung carefully the night before, was damp at the collar and wrinkled along the side where she'd leaned against the crate for most of the journey. She was not unaware of how she looked. That was perhaps the cruelest part of it. Naomi Calloway had spent 32 years being very, very aware of how she looked. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered and full-figured in a way that no amount of careful dressing could disguise, and she had learned early that the world had opinions about that. Loud opinions, frequently. She had also learned that there was a difference between knowing a thing and being prepared for it, and no amount of knowing could have prepared her for Red Hollow on that Tuesday morning. She climbed down from the wagon without help. The driver had already moved to unload his cargo, and she straightened her skirt and picked up her suitcase and looked at the street in front of her. It was a modest town. One main road, buildings on either side, a water trough near the livery that needed cleaning. A group of men were gathered outside the post office, doing nothing in particular with great dedication. 2 women in front of the dry goods store had paused their conversation to look at the wagon and therefore at her. Naomi reminded herself why she was here. His name was Edwin Bart. They had been corresponding for 7 months. His first letter had come through the Matrimonial Gazette. She still had it, folded in the inner pocket of her suitcase, though she could recite it from memory if asked. He had described himself as a man of moderate means, 38 years of age, owner of a cattle operation east of Red Hollow, recently widowed, father of no children. He was looking for a woman of good character and practical nature, he had written, someone who understood that frontier life was not glamorous, but that honest work built something real. He was not interested in beauty so much as backbone. She had written back, 7 months of letters, careful, honest, sometimes funny letters. She had told him about her work as a seamstress in Missouri. She had told him about her father's death 2 winters ago and how she had managed the household accounts for 3 years before that. She had told him that she was not a delicate woman in any sense of the word, not in constitution and not in appearance. And she had written that last part plainly because she believed honesty at the start saved grief at the end. He had written back every time. He had seemed, or she had believed him to seem, completely untroubled by any of it. So she walked toward him now, suitcase in hand, heart doing something uncomfortably quick behind her ribs, and she told herself that this was simply the beginning of a new chapter, and that nervousness was normal, and that in 6 months she would look back on this moment and laugh. Edwin Bart was standing in front of the land office, which was apparently where they had agreed to meet in his last letter, though she had pictured something slightly less public. He was taller than she'd imagined, thinner. He had a narrow face and pale eyes, and he was wearing a jacket despite the heat, which struck her as the kind of thing a man did when he wanted to make an impression. He saw her coming. She watched him see her. There was a moment, barely a second really, where his expression did something complicated that she might have been able to ignore if he had recovered from it quickly. But he didn't recover from it. He stood there and he let the complicated thing happen on his face, and he let it settle into something that was not complicated at all. It was simple and clear and absolutely unmistakable. Disappointment, followed closely by something uglier. She stopped about 4 feet from him because something in his posture made her stop. Her suitcase was heavy. She put it down. "Mr. Bart," she said. He looked at her the way she had described earlier, slowly, thoroughly, without any attempt to hide what he was doing, head to toe and back again. She counted the seconds. She got to 5. "You're bigger than your letters said." She heard it. The men outside the post office heard it. The 2 women by the dry goods store heard it. A boy who had been sweeping the porch of the barber shop stopped sweeping. Naomi did not move. "My letters," she said carefully, "were accurate in every particular. A woman who looks like you—" He paused, reconsidered, started again with more confidence. "This ain't what I agreed to. I was expecting someone—" Another pause, and this one was somehow worse because he appeared to be genuinely searching for a diplomatic word and failing. "Someone more, smaller," said one of the men by the post office, helpfully, and there was that single laugh. "One person. It only took one." Edwin Bart's chin came up a little, emboldened. "I can't take a wife I'm not. That doesn't suit what I had in mind. It wouldn't be fair to either of us." "You corresponded with this woman for 7 months," said a voice. It came from somewhere behind Naomi and to her left, and she didn't turn around, not yet, because she was still looking at Edwin Bart and trying to determine whether her legs were going to continue holding her upright. They were. Barely. "That's between me and her," Edwin said. "You brought her here from Missouri," the voice continued. It was a low voice, unhurried. Not angry, exactly, just factual, in a way that somehow made the facts sound worse. "She crossed 3 states on the strength of your word. I didn't promise anything that couldn't be. You wrote her letters for 7 months and asked her to come." Edwin Bart's jaw tightened. "A man has the right to change his mind." "Sure he does," said the voice. "Question is whether he's got the decency to do it before the woman sells her furniture and packs her life into one bag." Naomi turned around then. He was standing about 15 feet away near the edge of the road. A big man, not fat, but broad and solid the way working men get when the work has been going on for 20 years. He was probably 40 or so, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had spent considerable time outdoors. He wasn't dressed for town the way Edwin was. His jacket was worn at the elbow. He had a hat in his hand rather than on his head, which she couldn't explain but somehow noticed. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Edwin Bart. "Mind your own affairs, Mercer," Edwin said. The man, Mercer, didn't answer that. He put his hat back on, slowly, like a man who was thinking about something else. Naomi looked back at Edwin. She had made a decision somewhere in the last 30 seconds, though she couldn't have told you exactly when. "I'll need the cost of my passage back," she said. Edwin blinked. "What?" "The stage line, the supply wagon from the junction. You brought me here. You'll pay to send me back, or—" She picked up her suitcase. "Or we can stand here and continue this conversation while the whole town listens." A muscle in Edwin's jaw moved. He looked at the growing cluster of observers, some of whom had given up any pretense of doing something else. "I don't owe you—" "The cost of my passage," she repeated. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of her voice in that moment. "That's all I'm asking." "I'll get you the money," Edwin said finally, quietly, with the specific tone of a man who wanted this to be over. "Come to my office." "I'll wait here," Naomi said. He stared at her. "I'll wait here," she said again. He went. She stood on the main street of Red Hollow with her suitcase at her feet and her spine straight and the entire town looking at her, and she breathed. In and out. In and out. She thought about her apartment in Missouri, which she had vacated 3 weeks ago. She thought about the furniture she had sold to a neighbor woman for half its value because she hadn't wanted to deal with the shipping. She thought about the letter she had written to her cousin Sarah, telling her about the wedding that was going to happen in October. She did not cry. It was the one thing she had decided she would not do, standing there on that road, and it was the hardest decision she'd made in years. Edwin came back with the money. Not quite enough, she knew, but she took it without comment. And then he left without another word, and she was alone on the street with a suitcase and the wrong amount of money and nowhere to sleep that night. The crowd dissipated, which was somehow worse. People glanced back as they walked away, and she could feel those glances on the back of her neck like flies. The two women by the dry goods store leaned together and spoke quietly. She needed to find a boarding house. She had enough for maybe 4 nights, 5 if she was careful. She needed to find work, or she needed to find a way back east, and either option felt impossible in this moment, but both needed to happen before nightfall. She picked up her suitcase and started walking toward what looked like the most promising end of the street. "There's a boarding house on Clement Street," said a voice beside her. She hadn't heard him approach. Mercer was walking next to her now, or slightly behind her, at a careful distance that struck her as deliberate. "Mrs. Holt runs it. She's not warm, but she's fair. $3 a week, and she'll let you work for your board if you need to." Naomi kept walking. "Thank you. There's also the hotel, but that's 5 and the beds are worse." "I'll try Mrs. Holt." They walked in silence for a moment. She was waiting for him to say something else, something that would reveal the angle, because in her experience, men who stepped forward in situations like this one usually had an angle. "I have a ranch east of town," Mercer said. "Not Bart's direction. Different road. I've got 2 boys, 12 and 14. No wife since 3 years back." Naomi stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Up close, he had deep-set eyes, very dark, and there were lines around them from squinting against the sun. He met her gaze without flinching, which she noted. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "if you're about to propose the same arrangement I just declined publicly in front of half this town, no." He said it immediately, flatly. "No, that's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "What I was going to say is that I need someone to manage the household. Cooking, organizing, keeping accounts. My operation has been—" He paused in the way men paused when they were about to admit something they found difficult to admit. "It's been struggling. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm looking for someone who can work, and I pay fair. And if Mrs. Holt's rates don't suit your situation, there's a room at the ranch." She studied him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "Why what?" "Why me? You don't know me." He thought about that. Not a polite pause, an actual pause, the kind that meant he was actually thinking. "Because," he said finally, "you stood on that street for 12 minutes with a man making a fool of himself at your expense, and you didn't once let him see that it hurt. And then you asked him for your passage money instead of just walking away. That tells me something." Naomi looked at him for another long moment. She thought about her cousin Sarah's letter. She thought about the furniture she had sold. She thought about the 7 months of correspondence she had conducted with a man who turned out to have looked at her letters and seen what he wanted to see instead of what was actually there. She thought about the fact that she had $43 and no return ticket, and a suitcase with everything she owned in it standing on a dirt road in a town where she didn't know a single soul. "What does it pay?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, though she wasn't sure. He told her. It was less than she would have liked and more than she had expected, and after a moment she picked up her suitcase and said, "You'll need to show me the accounts before I agree to anything. I won't walk into another situation blind." "That's fair," he said, "and the room is separate, my own door, my own key. There's a lock already." "Then I'll look at the accounts tomorrow morning," she said. "Tonight I'm staying at Mrs. Holt's." He nodded. He didn't argue about it, which she had half expected him to. 8 o'clock tomorrow, he said. "I'll be here." She walked to Mrs. Holt's boarding house, got a room, sat on the edge of the bed in the early afternoon heat, and only then, with the door locked and no one to see, let herself shake. Just for a few minutes, just until the shaking ran out. Then she opened her suitcase, unpacked her good dress to hang, and let the wrinkles fall, and started making a list of everything she needed to find out about Mercer Ranch before she made any decisions. She was methodical that way, always had been. The list was long. She worked on it until supper, eating alone in the small dining room while Mrs. Holt moved around the kitchen without speaking. After supper, she added 3 more items to the list, reviewed the numbers Edwin Bart had given her for passage money, noted the discrepancy with precise irritation, and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of Red Hollow settling in for the night. A dog somewhere distant, the wind moving through something dry. She thought about what Mercer had said. You didn't once let him see that it hurt. He had been wrong about that, she decided, or at least incomplete. She had let them all see it in the exact way she'd chosen to let them see it, which was not the same as not letting them see it at all. The difference mattered, though she wasn't sure she could explain why. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow there would be accounts to review and a decision to make, and a life to figure out from scratch in a town where she'd already become something people talked about. She had been talked about before. She had survived it before. That was what she held on to. In the dark, in the strange bed, in the strange town with $43 and a list and the memory of Edwin Bart's face doing that complicated thing when he saw her. She had survived worse, and she intended to keep doing it. Silas Mercer arrived at Mrs. Holt's boarding house at 5 minutes to 8, which told Naomi something about him before he opened his mouth. She was already waiting on the front step with her list folded in her coat pocket and a second list in her head. And when she saw him pull up in a wagon that had seen better decades, she noted that too. The horse was well fed. The harness was repaired in 3 places with different materials. The man took care of what mattered and made do with the rest. She climbed up without waiting for him to offer a hand. He didn't seem bothered by that. They rode east out of Red Hollow without much conversation, which suited her. The land opened up gradually, flat at first, then rolling in slow waves toward a line of hills that sat purple and distant against the morning sky. She used the time to watch how he handled the horse, whether he was impatient or easy with it, whether he watched the road or drifted. He watched the road. He was easy with the horse. These were small things, but she had learned to read small things. After about 20 minutes, he said, I should tell you, the place isn't much to look at right now. I didn't ask what it looked like. A pause. No, I suppose you didn't. Another 5 minutes of road. My wife died in the winter of '83, he said. Not like he was offering personal information, more like he was filling in a gap in a report. Fever. It went fast. After that, the household kind of... He stopped. Things slipped. Naomi had questions about that, but she saved them for the accounts. When the ranch came into view, she understood what he meant by slipped. The main house was structurally sound. She could see that at a glance. But it had the particular look of a place where maintenance had been postponed so many times it had become the default condition. The barn needed paint on the south side. There was a fence section near the gate that had been propped up with a piece of timber instead of properly reset. The yard between the house and the outbuildings was not dirty, exactly, but it had the cluttered feeling of a space where things got put down and not picked back up. 2 boys were standing near the barn. They had clearly been told to be there because they were standing in the specific way that boys stood when they'd been instructed to make a good impression and were resentful about it. The older one, 14, she remembered, had his arms crossed. The younger one, 12, was staring at her with the unfiltered curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that staring was rude, or hadn't cared to learn. That's Cal, and that's Jessie, Silas said, stepping down from the wagon. Boys, this is Miss Calloway. Ma'am, said Jessie, the younger one, because someone had drilled manners into him at some point. Cal said nothing, just looked at her with a flat expression that reminded her uncomfortably of his father when his father was being careful. You're the woman from town, Cal said finally. The one Bart turned away. Cal. Silas's voice was quiet, but it carried weight. I'm just saying what everyone said. I know what you're just saying. Naomi looked at Cal directly. He was tall for 14, nearly as tall as his father, with the kind of thin, angular face that would probably fill out in a few years into something decent. Right now it was mostly jaw and suspicion. Yes, she said. That's me. Do you have a problem with that? He blinked. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't a direct question. No, he said. Then, after a beat, Ma'am. She nodded once and turned to Silas. You mentioned accounts. The accounts were kept in a wooden box on the desk in what Silas called the office, which was a small room off the kitchen that smelled like old paper and something burnt. He set the box on the desk and then stood to the side in the way men stood when they were about to be told something they didn't want to hear and had decided to get it over with. She opened the box. She did not say anything for a long time. The records went back 6 years, which was useful, and they were not entirely illegible, which was a surprise given what she was finding in them. The numbers themselves were the problem. Not fraudulent. She could see that immediately. They were the numbers of a man who understood cattle and land and weather and understood almost nothing about money as a system. He had been paying his supply contracts on a schedule that made no logical sense relative to his income cycle. He had a loan on the East Pasture that was structured in a way that cost him nearly double the principal over 10 years. He had 3 separate accounts with the Red Hollow Bank that should have been one, and the fees on the smallest account alone had eaten what looked like $30 over the past 2 years for no reason except that nobody had noticed. "How long has it been since someone looked at these?" she asked. Silas was leaning against the doorframe. "My wife handled most of it. After she passed, I did what I could." "And before that? Did she have any training in accounts?" "She was smart, kept things tidy." "That's not what I asked." He shifted his weight slightly. "No formal training. She learned as she went." Naomi turned a page. "You have a supply contract with a man named Greer in Hanston." "That's right. Greer's been providing feed and hardware since '79. You're paying 11 cents above market rate on the feed and have been since '81. That's..." She did the math in her head quickly, confirmed it on paper. "That's roughly $60 over the past 5 years. Have you renegotiated this contract at any point?" Silence. "No," he said. "Have you compared his rates to any other supplier?" Another silence. This one had a different texture. "I knew Greer's father," Silas said. "We had an understanding." "His father is apparently not the one writing your invoices." She heard him exhale slowly through his nose. It was the sound of a man who had suspected something was wrong for a long time and had been hoping it was less wrong than it actually was. She kept going through the records. She found 2 more supply contracts with similar problems. She found a payment to a county assessor that was documented only as miscellaneous fee, with no further notation, which she circled and set aside. She found a promissory note from 1880 that had been satisfied but not properly recorded, which meant it could theoretically be used against him if anyone chose to. She put that in the set-aside pile as well. By the time she looked up, 2 hours had passed, and the set-aside pile was significant. Silas was still in the room. He had moved at some point from the doorframe to a chair in the corner, and he was watching her with an expression that she was starting to recognize as his default: careful, measuring, not giving much away. "It's not catastrophic," she said. "That's the best thing you've said since we got here." "I didn't say it was good. I said it wasn't catastrophic. There's a difference." She tapped the set-aside pile. "Several of these problems can be corrected. The supply contracts need to be renegotiated. The loan structure on the East Pasture should be reviewed. There may be room to restructure depending on what the bank is willing to do. These 3 accounts need to be consolidated." She paused. "The miscellaneous fee payment concerns me." "Why?" "Because I don't know what it is. And in my experience, payments you can't explain are either harmless or they're not, and the only way to know which is to trace them." He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees. "You know a fair amount about accounts for a seamstress." It was not quite an accusation. She looked at him. "My father ran a dry goods business for 18 years, she said. "I kept his books from the time I was 14. When he got sick, I managed the accounts and the ordering and the vendor relationships for 3 years, while also sewing alterations for every woman in our county who wanted a dress for something important. I described myself as a seamstress because that's the work I was being paid for directly." She held his gaze. "Is there a problem with that?" He held up a hand. "No, no problem." "Good." She turned back to the papers. He was quiet for a moment. "What would it take," he said slowly, "to get this operation running properly?" "Time. Consistent record keeping. Some difficult conversations with your suppliers." She thought for a moment. "And you'll need to tell me everything. Not the version you think sounds best. Everything." "That's a lot to ask." "Yes," she agreed. "Do you want my help or not?" He looked at her for a long moment. "What are your terms?" She told him. It was the same rate he had offered, plus the room, plus Sundays off. He agreed without negotiating, which she had not quite expected. "One more thing," she said. "Your son, Cal." Silas's expression shifted slightly. "What about him?" "He's going to be a problem for about 2 weeks. Then he won't be." She folded her hands on the desk. "I'm not asking you to intervene. I'm just telling you so you're not surprised." He looked at her for a long moment. "You seem very sure about that." "I've managed difficult people before." She paused. "I was one, when I was 14 and someone new came into my father's business." Something moved across Silas Mercer's face that she didn't have a name for yet. He nodded once and stood. "I'll show you the room," he said. The room was small and had a window that faced east and a door with a lock that worked. She tested the lock twice. It worked both times. She unpacked her suitcase into the narrow wardrobe, hung her blue dress on the hook behind the door, and set her account books, 2 of them, which she'd brought from Missouri out of habit, on the table by the window. Then she went back to the kitchen and started making an inventory of what was in it. She was not hired to cook, but she was hungry, and the kitchen was a disaster, and she had learned at a young age that the fastest way to understand any household was to understand what it fed itself and how. What she found was not encouraging. There was food, enough food, but it was stored without logic, some of it going soft on shelves where better rotation would have given it another 2 weeks of good use. There was a pot on the stove from what appeared to be 2 days ago. There were 4 plates and 3 matching cups, and a 5th cup that didn't match that had a chip in the handle. She was standing at the stove deciding what to do about the old pot when Jesse appeared in the doorway. He was watching her with that direct, unguarded stare. "You're not going to throw that out, are you?" he said, meaning the pot. "That's perfectly good stew. It's been sitting for 2 days. Pa eats things that have been sitting longer than that." "Your father," she said, without turning around, "has probably had stomach trouble that he's attributed to something else." A pause. "He does complain about his stomach." "I imagine so." She picked up the pot and made a decision. "This goes out. I'll make something fresh. Do you know if there are vegetables in the cellar?" Jesse moved into the kitchen with the energy of a boy who had no particular reason to be suspicious of her yet, and therefore wasn't. "There's potatoes and onions, some carrots that might still be okay. Go check the carrots and bring me whatever's still firm." He went. Just like that. She had the pot cleaned and a new one started by the time Cal appeared in the doorway. He stood there in the posture of someone who had come in search of something to object to. She gave him time to find it. "Jesse's in the cellar," he said. "I know. I sent him. You don't work here yet." "Your father agreed to terms this morning. I work here." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "If you'd like to be useful, you could find me another onion." "I'm not your errand boy." "No," she agreed. "You're a 14-year-old boy who's angry about things he doesn't entirely understand yet, which is reasonable, but I still need an onion." Silence. "There's some in the basket by the back door," he said finally. His voice had lost about half its edge. "Thank you." He did not bring her the onion, but he also didn't leave, which she counted as progress. The first week was an education in several directions at once. She started with the supply contracts because they were the most immediately actionable problem. She drafted a letter to Greer and Hanston requesting a renegotiation meeting and citing 3 specific competing prices she had researched through the county trade journal that Silas kept in a stack by his desk, apparently unread. She also sent letters to 2 other suppliers she had identified, requesting their current rate sheets. Silas watched this happen with an expression that oscillated between impressed and anxious. "Greer's not going to like that," he said, reading the letter over her shoulder. "He doesn't have to like it. He has to respond to it. He's known people in this county for 30 years. If he decides to be difficult, then we'll have a clearer picture of what kind of business relationship we're actually in." She looked up at him. "I've written it politely. I've given him the benefit of the doubt that this is a misunderstanding rather than deliberate overcharging. But I need you to understand something, Mr. Mercer." She turned in her chair to face him directly. "Nobody corrects a problem they don't know anyone has noticed. Greer's been charging you above market for 4 years. He stopped noticing because no one said anything." Silas worked his jaw for a moment. "You think he knew?" "I think he's a businessman." He was quiet for a long time, then, "Send the letter." The boys were another project running simultaneously. Jesse warmed to her fast, almost too fast, with the specific eagerness of a boy who missed having a woman in the house and wasn't old enough to be guarded about showing it. He started appearing in the kitchen at mealtimes with updates about the ranch that nobody had asked for, delivering them to Naomi as though she were a person who would find them interesting, which she did, though she was careful not to show it too obviously because she could feel Cal watching. Cal watched everything. He did not warm. But he also, slowly, stopped actively obstructing her. The hostility faded from sharp to guarded, which was not the same thing as trust, but was movement in a direction she recognized. The thing that changed it, or started to change it, happened at the end of the second week, and it happened over the accounts. She had been working late in the office when she heard someone in the kitchen. It was past 10, which was late for a ranch household, and she assumed it was Silas until she came through the door and found Cal standing at the table with one of the account ledgers open in front of him. He startled, closed the ledger. Then, because he was Cal, lifted his chin and didn't apologize for being caught. "That's the operating account," she said. "I know what it is." "You can read accounts?" A pause. "Some. Pa showed me some of it. I used to try to—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "You were trying to figure out how bad it was." He looked at her sideways. "You're the oldest," she said. "You've probably known for a while that something was wrong. You couldn't fix it because you didn't have the knowledge. That's frustrating." His jaw tightened. "I'm 14. I started keeping accounts at 14. My father was sick and someone had to." She pulled the ledger toward her and opened it to the page he'd been looking at. "What were you trying to understand?" Silence. "This column," he said finally, pointing. "These numbers don't add up the way they should." She looked. He was right. She had already caught and corrected that discrepancy. But the fact that he had seen it, the fact that he had been in here late at night trying to see it, rearranged something in her understanding of him. "You're right," she said. "They don't. I've already noted it. Look." She turned to the corrected page in the newer ledger she'd been maintaining. "This is what it should look like." He leaned in, reluctantly, and then less reluctantly. For the next 40 minutes, she walked him through the basics of double-entry accounting. Not because she'd planned to, but because he kept asking questions, and the questions were good. Not performed, not polite, genuinely good questions from a boy who had a head for numbers and hadn't had anyone to notice it. He didn't thank her when he finally went to bed. But at breakfast the next morning, he told Jesse to stop leaving his boots by the kitchen door because Miss Calloway needed to be able to move around in there. Jesse stared at him. "Since when do you care about that?" "Since now," Cal said. And that was the end of it. Naomi, pouring coffee at the stove, did not smile where anyone could see it. The letter from Greer arrived on a Thursday, and it was not the response she had hoped for. He did not dispute the figures. He did not offer to renegotiate. What he did was write 4 paragraphs of careful language that amounted to saying that his prices were his prices, that he had a long relationship with the Mercer operation, and that he hoped this inquiry was not a sign that certain newcomers to the county were causing unnecessary friction where none was needed. Newcomers. She read that word 3 times. She set the letter down on Silas's desk and pushed it toward him. He read it and set it down and looked at a spot on the wall. "Newcomers," he said. "Yes?" "He's talking about you." "Obviously." She kept her voice level. "The question is what you want to do about it." Silas picked the letter up again, put it back down. "He's been my supplier for 12 years. "I know. People in this county, they have long memories. If Greer decides to make noise about this, he's already decided what he thinks about me, Mr. Mercer. That decision was made when the wagon pulled into Red Hollow and Edwin Bart opened his mouth. I can't change that. What I can do is my job." She folded her hands. "But I need to know if you're going to stand behind the decisions we make here, or if every time someone pushes back, you're going to reconsider." Silas looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that covered some distance. "Send Greer a final letter," he said. "Tell him we're moving our account to Harder's in Millfield, effective the 1st of next month, unless he can match the market rate. Give him 2 weeks." She reached for the paper. "And Naomi," he said. She looked up. It was the first time he'd used her given name. "I hired you because I thought you knew what you were doing," he said. I still think that. So stop asking me if I'm going to back you up and just do the work. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said, and started writing. Greer came back in 11 days with a new rate that was only 4 cents above market, which was not perfect, but was negotiable, and she negotiated it. Silas was not in the room when she did it. She handled it herself when Greer's representative came to the ranch, and she handled it with a pleasantness that the man later apparently described to someone in town as surprisingly reasonable, which she found instructive about what he had expected. The story got around the way things in small counties always got around. A rancher's housekeeper had renegotiated a supply contract that had been running at inflated prices for 4 years. She had done it with a letter and a rate sheet and a 2-week deadline. Some people found this unremarkable. Others, the ones who had similar contracts with Greer, which turned out to be more ranchers than expected, found it worth thinking about. 2 ranchers from the neighboring properties came by the second month separately with the specific diffidence of men who wanted information but didn't want to seem like they wanted it. She gave them what she could without overstepping. One of them renegotiated his own contract within the week. The other one sat on it. She didn't know why, and she didn't follow up because it wasn't her business. The thing she had not expected, or not fully expected, was the exhaustion. Not physical, though the physical work was real and consistent. It was the other kind. The awareness, constant and low grade, of being watched. Every decision she made at the ranch existed in a context that extended beyond the ranch, because she was the woman from the scene on Main Street, and that scene had given everyone in the county a story about her that they hadn't bothered to verify. She was variously, depending on who you asked, a grasping opportunist who had latched onto a widower, or a pitiable charity case, or some kind of fraud who had misrepresented herself in her correspondence and gotten what she deserved. Nobody came and said these things to her face, but she heard them in the way you heard things in small places, sideways, through the gaps in conversations that stopped when she walked near, through the way certain women looked at her at the general store, through the careful way Mrs. Holt, that first week, had suggested she might want to be discreet about her arrangement at the Mercer place. Discreet. She had thought about that word for days. She had done nothing she needed to be discreet about. She was an employee. She had a room with a lock. She kept accounts and managed a household and was doing her level best to stabilize an operation that had been slowly falling apart for 3 years. Every morning she got up before anyone else in the house and had the stove going before Jesse stumbled into the kitchen looking for coffee he was too young to drink. And every night she was the last one in the office, cross-referencing numbers by lamplight until her eyes ached. None of this was visible to the people forming opinions about her in Red Hollow. She was thinking about this one afternoon, later in the second month, near the end of October, when the first cold was coming in and the kitchen window had started to let in a draft she'd been meaning to address. When Jesse came in and dropped onto a chair at the table with the full dramatic weight of someone 12 years old who had had an encounter. "Tommy Greer said you came from nowhere and you're going to cheat Pa out of everything," he announced. She kept stirring. "Tommy Greer is Hector Greer's son?" "Grandson." "Ah. He said it at school, in front of everyone." Jesse pulled at a loose thread on his sleeve. "I told him that was stupid." "What did he say to that?" "He said his grandfather said so it wasn't stupid." Jesse paused. "Then I said his grandfather had been cheating Pa for 4 years, so maybe he wasn't the best judge of stupid." Naomi stopped stirring. She set down the spoon and turned around. Jesse was looking at her with a complicated expression, part proud of himself, part waiting to be told he'd done something wrong. "Did that start a fight?" she asked. "A little one." He showed her his knuckle, which had a scrape on it. "I won." She looked at the knuckle. She looked at him. She turned back to the stove because she did not want him to see whatever was on her face right now, and she was not entirely sure what it was. "Jesse," she said after a moment, "you didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't need to." His voice had shifted into something more like Cal's register, that flat certainty. "I wanted to." She stirred the pot. Outside, the wind was picking up across the flat land and the kitchen window rattled in its frame, and she made a mental note about the caulking and thought about Tommy Greer and thought about Jesse's scraped knuckle and thought about how she had not expected, when she climbed down from that supply wagon 2 months ago with a suitcase and $43, that she would find herself standing in someone else's kitchen carrying what happened to that person's 12-year-old son. She had not planned for that particular complication. It was there anyway. That was the problem with people. You tried to keep them at a practical distance, and then one of them came home with a scraped knuckle from defending your name, and the distance stopped being practical. She put a bowl of stew in front of Jesse and sat down across from him with the draft ledger she'd been updating and told him to eat before it got cold, and he ate, and she worked. And outside, the October wind moved across the empty land between Red Hollow and everything beyond it, and for a little while neither of them said anything. It was the closest thing to quiet that Naomi Calloway had felt in years. Not peaceful, exactly. She was still calculating, still adding columns in the margin of the ledger, still aware of everything that needed doing. But something in it was close enough to rest that she let herself have it for a few minutes, before she turned the page and kept going. The winter came in hard that year, the kind that settled into the ground and stayed, and Naomi learned the ranch the way you learned anything worth knowing, slowly, through mistakes, through the particular texture of each problem as it presented itself. By December, she had consolidated the 3 bank accounts into one, restructured the payment schedule on the East Pasture loan in a renegotiation that had taken 2 trips to Red Hollow and one very uncomfortable meeting with a bank officer named Pullman, who had the specific manner of a man who had never expected to be outmaneuvered by a woman and was still processing it. She had renegotiated 4 supply contracts. She had found the source of the miscellaneous fee payment. It was a legitimate county drainage assessment, poorly documented, nothing sinister, and filed it properly. She had also quietly begun keeping a second set of notes entirely separate from the official ledgers, not because she suspected fraud within the ranch, but because she had learned from her father's business that the moment you stopped watching was the moment something you hadn't expected arrived. She was watching when Edwin Bart came back. It was a Monday in late January, cold enough that the breath of the wagon horse hung in the air like smoke. She saw him from the kitchen window, recognized the narrow set of his shoulders before she recognized his face, and she stood very still for a moment with a dish towel in her hands, and let herself feel what she felt about that, which was not nothing. Then she folded the dish towel, set it on the counter, and went to the door. He was standing in the yard when she opened it, hat in hand, which was the same gesture Silas used but meant something entirely different coming from Edwin Bart. Silas took his hat off because he was thinking. Edwin took his hat off because he had decided it was a useful prop. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Bart." He looked past her at the house. "Is Mercer here?" "He's in the East Pasture. Did you need something?" Edwin shifted his weight. The cold was making his nose red, and he looked up close, like a man who had rehearsed something and was now recalibrating. I thought perhaps it was time to clear the air, between us." "Between us," she repeated. "I handled things badly in July." He said it with the tone of a man reading from a script he found distasteful. "I was surprised. I reacted poorly. You publicly humiliated me in front of 30 people. His jaw tightened. "I said I handled it badly." "You did, and now you've said so. Was there something else?" He looked at her again, that same slow look from July, though this time something was different about it. It was calculating where it had been contemptuous before, and she found calculation significantly more concerning than contempt. "I've heard good things," he said, "about the work you've been doing here. The county's noticed." "That's kind." "It's not just kind, it's—" He paused, tried a different approach. "I made a mistake in July. A serious one. I've thought about it considerably, and I think if we were to begin correspondence again under better circumstances—" "No," she said. He blinked. He had not expected it to be that quick. "I'm not interested in correspondence, Mr. Bart, or any other arrangement with you." She kept her voice completely even. "I hope the drive out here wasn't too cold." His expression moved through several stages. Surprise, then something wounded that she did not believe, then something else that dropped below the surface before she could name it. "You'd do well to think carefully," he said. His voice had changed. The rehearsed regret was gone. "A woman in your position, working in another man's house? There are people in this county who've already decided what that means. I could help quiet that talk, or—" He let it sit there. Or you could leave, she said. He put his hat back on. I'll come back when Mercer's here. You can do that, but my answer won't change based on who's standing next to me when I give it. He left. She watched the wagon until it was off the property, then went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, doing nothing in particular. The stove was putting out good heat. The window draft she'd caulked in November was holding. Everything was the same as it had been 20 minutes ago. She picked up the dish towel and finished what she'd been doing, and she told herself that the tightness across her shoulders was just the cold. She told Silas that evening. She had considered not telling him. It was her business, her conversation, her problem to manage. But she had also learned in 2 months of working alongside him that the things you didn't tell Silas Mercer had a way of becoming complications later, and she had enough complications. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. He let her finish. He threatened you, Silas said. He implied. There's a difference, legally. I'm not talking about legally. She looked at him. I know you're not. I'm telling you because you should know he's been here, and because his reasons for coming weren't what he said they were. What were they? She had been thinking about this all afternoon. He's been watching the ranch, watching what I've been doing here. The supply contract renegotiations. Those got talked about. Greer talked about it, I assume, to people who talked to other people. Edwin Bart is a man who made a public mistake in July, and the thing he's watching turn into a success is the thing he rejected. She folded her hands on the table. Men like that don't apologize because they're sorry. They apologize because they want something. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was doing its winter thing against the north wall of the house. You think he's going to be a problem, he said. I think he's going to try to be. I don't know what form it takes yet. She paused. I want you to know I didn't provoke it. I know you didn't. I'm just saying, Naomi. His voice was calm but direct. I know you didn't provoke it. She nodded once, gathered her papers, and went back to the office. She did not sleep well that night, which irritated her because she couldn't afford not to sleep. Edwin Bart did not come back in January. He did not come back in February. And for a few weeks in early March, with the first signs of thaw coming through and a new supply arrangement with Harder's and Millfield running smoothly and the East Pasture loan restructured and actually beginning to look manageable, Naomi allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had misjudged the situation, that perhaps Edwin had assessed his options and decided to let it go. She should have known better than to believe that. The trouble arrived not as a visit, but as a document. A legal document filed with the county land office on the 14th of March, claiming prior rights to the water access on the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Mercer land. The claim cited a survey from 1871 and asserted that the waterway had been improperly included in the Mercer deed, that the original survey had been in error, and that the rightful owner of the water access was a landholding company called the Crestfield Water and Land Trust. Silas read it 3 times at the kitchen table. Then he set it down and looked at it like it might change if he waited long enough. Crestfield, he said. I've never heard of a Crestfield anything in this county. Neither have I. Naomi picked up the document. That's the point. She read it again carefully, slower this time, paying attention to the language rather than the substance. Legal documents had their own grammar, and she had learned enough of it from her father's business disputes to recognize certain patterns. This is professionally drafted. This didn't come from a county surveyor with a grudge. Somebody paid for this. Why would anybody... Silas stopped. His face changed. Bart. That would be my guess. But guessing doesn't help us. She set the document back on the table. Without that water access, the East Pasture is worth a fraction of what it is. The cattle operation on that side can't function through summer without the creek. I know what the creek means to this ranch. I know you do. I'm saying it out loud because I want us both clear on what we're actually facing. She looked at him across the table. This isn't about the water. This is about the ranch. If this claim holds, you can't sustain operations on the eastern half of the property. You'd have to sell or restructure in a way that would take years to recover from. Silas sat back in his chair. The particular set of his shoulders, she had learned to read his shoulders before his face, told her he was angry, genuinely angry, but managing it. What do we do? He said. We find the original survey. She was already thinking through the steps, laying them out in order the way she laid out accounts. The claim says the 1871 survey was an error. That means there's a survey from 1871. I need to find it, and I need to find whoever conducted it, and I need to understand what it actually says versus what this document claims it says. That survey is 45 years old. The man who did it is probably dead. Then I need to find his records. She stood up. Who in this county keeps the oldest land records? Silas thought. County assessor's office would have some of it. But the older stuff, before the county was properly organized, that would be with the territorial office in Millfield. Then I'm going to Millfield. Naomi. He paused. It's a 2-day ride. I know. You'd be going alone. I've traveled alone before. I came here alone. She was already calculating what she needed to bring, how long the record search might take, whether Mrs. Holt's cousin in Millfield, whose name she'd gotten through Mrs. Holt during a rare civil exchange, might provide a room. I'll be back by the end of the week. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll drive you. You need to be here with the boys. Cal can manage for 3 days. Cal is 14. Cal, Silas said, has been managing things I didn't know he was managing for 2 years. 3 days won't break him. He folded the legal document and put it in his coat pocket. And I'm not sending you to Millfield alone on account of Edwin Bart. There was something in the way he said it that she chose not to examine too closely. She nodded. We leave tomorrow morning, she said. Early. The territorial office in Millfield was housed in a building that smelled like damp paper and old ambition, run by a clerk named Adler, who had the exhausted competence of a man who had been asked to find things in inadequate filing systems for 30 years. When Naomi explained what she was looking for, the 1871 survey of the eastern parcels in the Red Hollow area, specifically the creek boundary notations, Adler looked at her with the expression of a man being asked to find a particular grain of sand on a particular beach. 71, he said. That's the Holloway surveys, probably in the C section, maybe the D section. He didn't move. It'll take a while. I have time, Naomi said. Silas, standing slightly behind her, said nothing. He had been doing that since they arrived, present, available, saying very little, which she was starting to understand was his particular way of being useful. Adler found the first relevant document in 2 hours. It was not the survey itself, but a field notation ledger from the surveyor, a man named Thomas Price, that referenced the Eastern Creek boundary in the Red Hollow parcel group. The notation was brief but clear. The waterway had been assessed as a shared access boundary, with usage rights attached to the eastern parcel as part of its recorded deed. That was the important word. Attached. It meant the water rights were not incidental to the deed. They were part of it, explicitly. This isn't an error, Naomi said, holding the ledger close to the lamp. The survey didn't make a mistake. Whoever filed that claim is either ignorant of this document or hoping we are. Or hoping it's hard enough to find that it doesn't matter, Silas said. She looked at him. That's the more likely one. She spent the next 2 days in that office. Silas brought her food from the hotel dining room at noon, and she barely looked up when he set it beside her. She found the actual survey on the second afternoon, filed under a cross-reference she only located because she had started working backward from a different document entirely, a county boundary amendment from 1873 that cited the Price survey by number. The survey itself was intact, hand-drawn with the careful precision of a man who had taken his work seriously, and the creek boundary was marked clearly with water access notation on the eastern parcel. She also found something she had not expected. Tucked behind the survey, folded and slightly water-damaged but legible, was a letter. It was addressed to the Territorial Land Office from someone named R. Harmon, dated 1878, querying whether the Price survey records for the Red Hollow eastern parcels were secured against amendment. The letter had been filed without response notation, which meant either it had never been answered or the response had been filed elsewhere. But the question itself, whether the records were secured against amendment, was not the kind of question an innocent party asked. She read the letter twice, then she set it carefully to the side. Silas, she said. He was awake. He had been sitting across the room on a bench for the past 3 hours, not reading, not sleeping, just present in the particular way he had. And when she said his name, he was there immediately. She showed him the letter. He read it, His face did something complicated. R. Harmon, he said. Raymond Harmon. He was the county land official. He retired in 79, maybe 80. Retired. Or was encouraged to. There was talk, but nothing came of it. She looked at the letter. Someone has been looking at these records for a long time. The claim against your water rights isn't new. It's just the latest version of something older. She began gathering the documents she needed. I want copies of everything. The survey, the field notation, this letter, everything. Adler won't. I'll pay him. She had brought money for exactly this kind of contingency. I want it all certified. Adler, presented with the specific sum Naomi offered for certified copies, became considerably more helpful than he had been at the start. By late afternoon, she had everything she needed in a leather folder she had also purchased in Millfield specifically for this purpose. On the road back to Red Hollow, with the certified copies in her bag and the original documents safely in Adler's custody with a written record of her access, she sat on the wagon seat and went through everything in her head. Silas drove without speaking for a long time, which she appreciated. It's bigger than Bart, she said finally. I know. The Crestfield Water and Land Trust, that's not something one rancher puts together out of spite. That's organized, that's legal work, probably done in the city, probably with money behind it. She stared at the road ahead. I think Bart connected someone to something that already existed. He didn't build this, he found it and pointed it at you. Why me? Because you're vulnerable, because your operation has been struggling and it's documented, and because... She stopped. Because you're here, Silas said. He said it without bitterness, just fact. Yes, she didn't soften it. I've made your ranch visible. Before I came, you were a struggling widower that people left alone because there was nothing particularly interesting to take. Now people are paying attention, and someone decided that attention was useful. Silas was quiet for a moment. You think this is your fault. I think my presence accelerated it. That's not the same as fault. No, he said, it's not. Another mile of road passed. The water rights claim goes to the county court, he said. We'll need someone who can present the survey evidence. I know. She had been thinking about that. There was a lawyer in Red Hollow, a man named Dowd, who she had seen at the bank and who had the reputation, from what she'd gathered, of being competent without being expensive. She needed to talk to him before anyone else did. There's also Price, she said. The surveyor's dead. You said, Thomas Price is dead. But in the field notation ledger there was a second name, an assistant surveyor. She had memorized it. A man named Elias Croft. He would have been young in 1871. 20s, maybe. He could still be alive. Silas turned to look at her. If he is, he's a witness. Someone who is actually there. Who can testify to what the survey recorded and why. She held the leather folder tighter on her lap. I need to find him before Bart or whoever is behind this figures out he exists. They got back to the ranch on Thursday evening to find Cal had fed the livestock, done the morning and evening chores for 3 days, and made a credible if rough attempt at the accounts ledger for the time they'd been gone, which she discovered when she checked the office and found 3 days of supply records entered in a handwriting that was trying very hard to look like hers. She stood in the doorway of the office looking at those entries for a long moment. Cal was in the kitchen. She could hear him telling Jesse something in the low, authoritative tone he used when he was being the older brother. She did not go in and say anything about the ledger. She closed the office door and went to the kitchen and said that supper wasn't going to make itself. And Jesse immediately began looking for things to assist with, and Cal leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed in his habitual posture, except that his eyes, when they met hers briefly across the kitchen, had something in them that was new, something that looked, if she was reading it right, like relief that she was back. She looked away first and started on supper and did not make a thing of it. The meeting with Dowd the lawyer happened the following Monday. He was a careful man, thin and neat, who read the documents she provided without expression and asked questions in the precise manner of someone who had been trained not to react until he understood the full picture. When he finished, he set everything down on his desk and looked at her. The survey evidence is solid, he said. Properly certified, clear notation, consistent with the original deed. He paused. The complicating factor is the Crestfield Trust. They have representation. I've seen their attorney, a man from the city named Voss. He's good. He's going to argue that the survey notation is ambiguous and that the 1878 amendment process— there was an amendment process. Did you know that? I didn't, she said. There was a county-level boundary amendment process in 78 and 79. Several parcels were resurveyed. Voss is going to claim that the Mercer parcel should have been included and was improperly omitted, and that the water access reverted to the original territorial holding at that point. That's not what the records show. No, but it's what he's going to argue. Dowd leaned back in his chair. The R. Harmon letter is interesting, very interesting. If Harmon was the official overseeing that amendment process, and he was asking whether records were secured against amendment, that suggests someone was considering amending them without authorization. Can we use it? In court? Possibly. As part of a pattern of conduct argument. He was quiet for a moment. Miss Calloway, I have to ask you something directly. The Crestfield Trust, I've been doing some looking since Mercer contacted me last week. I believe I know who is behind it, or part of it, and it goes beyond Edwin Bart. She had expected this. She waited. There are 3 landholders in this county who have had water access disputes in the past 10 years. All of them small operators, all of them settled quietly, all of them with outcomes that favored parties connected to a holding group out of the city. He laid a piece of paper on the desk. This is what I've found so far. There may be more. She picked up the paper, read it. 3 names, 3 ranches, 3 settlements that, looked at separately, were just landowners who had lost disputes and moved on. Looked at together, they were something else. They were a pattern. How many people in this county know about this? She said. Including us, Dowd said. 4. She set the paper down. The office was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the main street of Red Hollow doing its ordinary midday things. A horse at the trough, someone crossing the boardwalk, a door somewhere opening and closing. I need to find Elias Croft, she said. Dowd nodded slowly. I'll make inquiries discreetly. He paused. Miss Calloway, if this goes where I think it might go, if the Crestfield Trust is what I think it is, and Harmon was part of it, this becomes considerably bigger than a water rights dispute. I know. Are you prepared for that? She thought about Edwin Bart standing in the yard in January with his hat in his hand and his calculated apology and his implied threat. She thought about Silas reading the legal document 3 times at the kitchen table. She thought about Cal's handwriting in the accounts ledger, trying to hold things together in her absence, and Jessie coming home with a scraped knuckle because someone said something about her at school. Yes, she said. I'm prepared. She walked back to where she'd tied the horse. She had been riding alone into town for 2 months now, and people had stopped commenting on it, and stood for a moment before mounting, looking at the main street of Red Hollow. Somewhere down that street, in July, she had stood with a suitcase at her feet and let the ground disappear beneath her, and decided she was not going to fall. She had arrived in this town with nothing and no one, and everything she had now she had built from that $43 and a leather folder full of certified documents and a room with a lock that worked. That she was not going to let Edwin Bart or the Crestfield Water and Land Trust or a city attorney named Voss take any of it. Not from her. Not from Silas. Not from 2 boys who were learning, in their separate ways, what it meant to trust someone who stayed. She mounted up and turned the horse toward the road east, and she let it move at a pace that suited the distance, and she thought about Elias Croft, and where a man who had been a young surveyor's assistant in 1871 might have ended up, and what he might remember, and whether he would be willing to say it in front of a county judge. She thought about it all the way back to the ranch, and by the time she got there she had the beginning of a plan that she did not yet know was going to shake the county to its foundations. Dowd found Elias Croft in the 2nd week of April. He was alive, 71 years old, living in a small house on the edge of a town called Faro, 40 miles southeast of Red Hollow, where he had been operating a modest cartography business for the past 20 years after his eyesight got too poor for field survey work. Dowd's letter came back with a note in a shaking but legible hand saying that yes, he remembered the 1871 surveys in the Red Hollow parcel group, and yes, he still had his personal field notes from that period, and yes, he would be willing to speak with someone about what those notes contained, provided that someone came to him because his traveling days were behind him. Naomi read the letter twice, the way she read everything important, and then set it on the desk and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. 71. Shaking handwriting, 40 miles. She started making a list of what she needed to bring. Silas found her in the office an hour later. He read the letter, set it down, and said, "I'll come with you. You came to Millfield, and I'll come to Faro." His voice was level. "This isn't negotiable, Naomi." She looked at him. There was something in the way he'd said it. Not controlling, not possessive, just a specific kind of quiet that meant he had made up his mind and was prepared to wait her out if necessary. "All right," she said. They left on a Thursday, which gave them Friday in Faro and the weekend to get back if anything went long. Cal, this time, did not need to be told what to do. He simply looked at his father, received a nod, and said he'd handle it. Jesse asked if he could come. Cal told him no. Jesse appealed to Naomi. Naomi told him what Cal said. Jesse made a face that communicated volumes and went to do his chores. The road to Faro ran through country that was flatter and more exposed than the land around Red Hollow, and they made the distance in a day and a half without trouble. Naomi spent most of the travel time thinking through the questions she needed to ask Croft, the order she needed to ask them in, and the specific documentary evidence she was bringing to compare against his field notes. She had the certified copies from Millfield in the leather folder. She had the original deed documentation that Silas had located in a box in the back of the office wardrobe, which she had found 3 months ago and filed properly, which he had not known about until she showed him. She had also, the night before they left, written out a complete timeline. Every document, every date, every name. It covered 4 pages. She knew it by memory. Elias Croft's house was small and precisely kept. The house of a man who had lived alone for a long time and had made his own arrangements with that fact. He answered the door himself, a compact man, still straight in the spine despite his age, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades looking at distances and learning to distinguish things that were close together. He looked at Naomi, he looked at Silas. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I made coffee." The coffee was strong and the chairs in his front room were mismatched, and there were maps on every wall, old ones, some of them covering areas she didn't recognize. Naomi noticed that the most recent one she could identify was dated 1869, which told her something about when his professional world had fixed itself in his memory. She set the leather folder on the table between them and did not open it immediately. "Mr. Croft," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you about why we're here and what we're hoping you can tell us, so you can decide whether you're willing to go further." He folded his hands around his coffee cup. "Appreciated." She explained the water rights claim. She explained the Crestfield Trust, the city attorney named Voss, the county court filing. She explained the 1878 Harmon letter and what it implied. She laid it out in the same order as her timeline, without editorializing, because she had learned that the cleanest way to present complicated information was to let the information be complicated and trust the other person to follow it. Croft listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. "I was 23 in 1871, he said. "Thomas Price was 60 and had been surveying this territory for 30 years. I was his third assistant in 4 years. The other 2 quit. Thomas was not an easy man to work for." A pause. "I was young, and I needed the work, and I stayed." "Can you tell us about the Red Hollow Eastern parcels?" Naomi asked. "I can do better than that." He stood up slowly with the specific deliberateness of a man who had learned not to trust his joints on the first attempt, and went to a cabinet in the corner. He came back with a box, a proper wooden box with a latch, not unlike the one Silas had kept his accounts in. Inside were field notebooks, perhaps 15 of them, organized by year. He found 1871 without hesitating, opened it to a section near the back. "The creek boundary notation," he said, sliding it across the table. "Thomas made the primary notation. My hand is the secondary. See this?" He pointed to a notation in a smaller, tighter script alongside the primary. "I recorded the water access attachment separately because Thomas had already moved on to the next parcel, and I wasn't certain his primary notation was clear enough. I added the language about the deed attachment, my language. Naomi looked at the notation. Then she opened the leather folder and set the certified copy of the original survey beside it. The language in Croft's field notebook was, word for word, the language in the survey notation. "You wrote this," she said. "I did." "And you remember writing it?" He looked at her. "Miss Calloway, I am 71 years old and my knees are unreliable. My memory is not." He tapped the field notebook. That water access was explicitly attached to the eastern parcel. It was not ambiguous. It was not an error. And it was not subject to the 1878 amendment process because it had already been recorded as a deed attachment, which placed it outside the scope of that process under the territorial guidelines that were in effect. Silas, who had said very little during all of this, leaned forward. "Can you say that in court?" Croft looked at him steadily. "I can say it anywhere that needs me to say it." A pause. "I've been waiting 45 years for someone to ask." Naomi looked up. "What do you mean?" The old man was quiet for a moment. He set his coffee down and looked at the map on the wall nearest them. A detailed rendering of the Red Hollow County area, she realized now, more detailed than she would have expected from a man who said his professional world had fixed itself before 1870. "In 1879, he said, a man came to see me. He didn't give a name I could verify. He told me that certain survey records in the Red Hollow area were going to be reviewed and that if any inconsistencies were found, it would reflect poorly on the surveyors involved. He was not threatening. He was careful. He said it like he was doing me a courtesy." Croft's mouth thinned. "I told him the records were accurate and that if anyone had concerns, they could file a formal query with the territorial office. And nothing came of it, at the time." He looked back at her. 3 years later, Thomas Price died. Natural causes. He was 68, and he had worked outside in all weather for 40 years. There was no reason to think anything of it. He paused. "But I thought about that visit. I thought about it for a long time. I kept these notebooks because Thomas always kept his. And because when that man came to see me, I decided that the best protection for accurate records was to have redundant copies in as many private hands as possible." The room was very quiet. "You knew someone was going to try this," Naomi said. "I thought someone might. Eventually. With Thomas gone and me in Faro where nobody much thought to look." He slid the field notebook across the table toward her. "Take it. I have a copy. I made one 10 years ago when my hands were steadier. Take the original. It's more use to you than to me sitting in this box." Naomi picked it up. It was lighter than she expected, just paper and ink and one man's careful handwriting in the cold of 1871, noting what the water was and who it belonged to and making sure it was written down right. "Mr. Croft," she said, "will you come to Red Hollow to testify?" He looked at his knees. He looked at the maps on his walls. He looked at her. "Give me 2 weeks to arrange things," he said. "My neighbor's boy can look after the house. I haven't been anywhere in 4 years." A pause. "It might be good for me." They drove back to Red Hollow with the field notebook in the leather folder and the leather folder in Naomi's bag, which she kept between her feet on the wagon floor the entire way. She was aware of its weight the whole drive. Not the physical weight, it barely had any, but the other kind. Silas drove. The country moved past them in the particular silence of early April, when the land was starting to come back from winter, but hadn't fully committed yet. After a while he said, "You knew he'd have something." "I hoped he would." "That's not the same thing as knowing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Another mile. "When you first came here," he said, "did you think it was going to turn into this?" She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew to consider things. "I thought I was going to stabilize some accounts and renegotiate some contracts and have a room with a lock and figure out what to do next." She looked at the road ahead. "I didn't think it was going to turn into a land fraud investigation." "Are you sorry it did?" She thought about it. "No." She meant it. "I'm not sorry." He nodded, like that confirmed something he'd been wondering about. They got back to find that in their absence, 2 things had happened. The first was that Dowd had received a communication from the Crestfield Trust's attorney Voss, formally requesting a pretrial meeting, which Dowd had declined pending his client's return. The second was that Edwin Bart had been in Red Hollow spreading a story. She heard about it from Jesse, who had heard it from a boy at school, who had heard it from his father at the hardware store. The story was that Naomi Calloway had forged documents in the Millfield Territorial Office, that she had paid the clerk Adler to certify false copies, and that her entire campaign against the water rights claim was built on fabricated evidence. She sat with that for a moment when Jesse told her. "Who's saying this?" she asked. "Mr. Bart, mostly, but people are talking about it." "Which people?" Jesse shifted uncomfortably. "At the store, mostly, and I heard Mrs. Crane said something at the post office." He paused. "Miss Calloway, did you—" "No," she said. "I didn't." He nodded immediately, with the specific, unqualified certainty of a 12-year-old who has made up his mind about someone. "I know, I told Tommy Greer that too." "Jesse, stop getting into fights about me!" "I didn't get into a fight this time. I just said it." He paused. "Loudly." She pressed her hand briefly to her forehead and then went to find Silas. The forgery accusation was, in its way, almost elegant, because Adler existed, and the payment existed, and the certified copies existed, and anyone who wanted to could look at those facts and construct a story from them that sounded plausible if you didn't know the whole picture. She had paid a clerk for certified copies. That was true. She understood immediately what Bart was doing, and she understood why. He was trying to get ahead of Croft. If her evidence was already tainted in the court of public opinion before Croft arrived and testified, then even a credible elderly witness with original field notebooks might not be enough to overcome the story Bart was planting. People heard the first version of things and held on to it. She knew this. Everyone knew this. She went to see Dowd the next morning. He had already heard. He looked at her when she came in with the expression of a man who was recalculating. "The forgery claim," she said. "What does it do to us legally?" "Nothing, yet. It's not a formal allegation. There's no filing, no complaint to the territorial office. It's just talk." He leaned back. "But if Voss decides to pick it up and formalize it, he will. Once Bart tells him the story is circulating." She sat down across the desk. "We need to do two things. First, I need Adler to provide a signed statement describing the legitimate nature of the certification process and confirming that the documents I had certified were the originals in the territorial office's possession. Second," she paused, "I think we need to go to the other ranchers." Dowd was quiet. "The 3 names on your list," she said, "the ranchers who settled their water disputes. I think we need to talk to them before the trial and find out exactly what happened to them. Because if the Crestfield Trust has done this before, and if those settlements were obtained through similar fraud, then this isn't just about Mercer Ranch. It's about all of them. And a county judge looking at a pattern of fraud against multiple landholders is looking at something very different than a single disputed survey." Dowd picked up a pen. "Put it down. Those men settled. They signed agreements. Some of them probably want to leave it alone." "Some of them probably do," she agreed. "But some of them might not. And I won't know which is which until I ask." She held his gaze. "I need the names and locations." He looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating expression she had come to recognize in him, the one that was deciding whether she was as clear-headed as she appeared or whether there was something reckless underneath it. "All right," he said, and wrote down the names. The first rancher, a man named Aldous Webb, who ran a sheep operation 15 miles north of Red Hollow, opened his door and looked at Naomi for a long moment before saying, with the flatness of a man who had swallowed something that still hurt, "I wondered when someone was going to come." She sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours. Webb was a slow talker, the kind who measured every word before committing to it, but once he started, he told her everything. The water dispute had come in 1882. He had been presented with a document claiming prior rights. He had hired a local man, not a real lawyer, just someone who did contract writing, and that man had looked at the document and said it appeared legitimate and that fighting it would cost more than settling. So he had settled. He had given up access to a spring that had been part of his property since 1875 in exchange for a payment that had seemed reasonable at the time and seemed increasingly like robbery the more years passed. Did you keep the documents from the dispute? Naomi asked. He left the room and came back with a tin box. Inside were papers that she recognized instantly as the same type of document she had been dealing with for the past month. Same legal language, same structure, different names, and different parcel numbers. She asked if she could take them, with his permission. He said yes before she finished asking. The second rancher, a woman named Ida Forsyth who ran cattle east of Millfield, had lost her dispute in 1884 and was considerably less philosophical about it than Webb. She met Naomi on her porch and said, before Naomi had explained the full situation, "If you're here about the water, I want whatever you're building and I want to be part of it." She did not have original documents. She had burned them, she said, because keeping them had felt like keeping something that hurt. But she remembered the name of the attorney who had represented the opposing party, which was a city name Naomi did not recognize, and she remembered the name of the document the trust had filed, which matched the naming structure of the claim against Mercer Ranch exactly. The third rancher on Dowd's list had died in 1885. His widow, a woman named Margaret Soule, was still on the property. She let Naomi in and served water without comment, and listened to everything and then said, in a voice that contained a specific kind of tiredness, "My husband tried to fight it. He hired Dowd, actually, but we ran out of money before the trial date and had to settle." She paused. He never stopped believing he'd been cheated. He said so until he died. Naomi left Margaret Soule's property with the names of 2 witnesses, a partial set of documents, and a very clear picture of how the Crestfield Trust operated. They found vulnerable operators. They filed fraudulent claims. They waited for the operators to exhaust themselves trying to fight it, and then offered settlements that looked like relief, but were actually the completion of the theft. It was organized and patient and had been running for over a decade. By the time she got back to Red Hollow, she had been traveling for 3 days across 4 properties, and the sky was the heavy purple-gray of an evening, deciding whether to rain. She was tired in a way that went down to the bone. She put the horse in the barn and went inside and found Silas in the kitchen with a pot on the stove and the lamp already lit. He looked at her when she came in. He didn't ask anything. He just turned back to the stove and said, "Sit down." She sat down, which she did not usually do before things were done for the evening. He put a bowl in front of her and sat across from her and waited while she ate, and she was aware dimly that nobody had waited for her like that in a very long time. 3 ranchers, she said, when she had eaten enough to think clearly. 3 separate disputes over 10 years. Same structure, same legal language, probably same city firm behind it. The Crestfield Trust is a vehicle, something that was set up specifically to hold these fraudulent claims so that no individual name appears on them. She set down her spoon. Bart didn't invent this. He found someone who already had it running and he handed them your water rights as a new target. That's what the January visit was. He was angry that you'd taken me on. He wanted to hurt you, and someone showed him how. Silas was looking at her with that careful expression of his. "Can we beat it?" he said. "Yes." She said it without hesitating because she had been asking herself that question for 3 days, and she had come to the answer the same way she came to any answer, by doing the arithmetic. Croft arrives next week. We have 3 corroborating cases that establish the trust pattern of conduct. We have the original survey, certified and witnessed. We have the Harmon letter showing foreknowledge of an attempt to manipulate records. And we have Dowd, who is better at his job than the trust's attorney is assuming. She looked at him. "We can beat it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure we have enough. I'm not sure about everything a courtroom does to enough." She met his eyes. "But yes, I'm sure." He nodded. Outside, the threatened rain arrived, a light, steady rain against the kitchen window, the kind that meant things growing rather than things drowning. After a moment, Silas said, without looking up from the table, "When you came here, when I made that offer on Main Street in July, I want you to know I wasn't thinking about any of this." "I know. I just thought—" He stopped, tried again. "You were standing there and something was wrong, and I had a practical offer to make, and I made it." "Yes. That's all it was, at the time." She looked at him. He was still looking at the table, not at her, in the specific way of a man who had gotten to the edge of something he'd been approaching for a while and was now deciding whether to step over it. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "I know," she said again, and meant something slightly different by it this time. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the table and said, "The rain'll help the east pasture." And she said yes, it would, and they sat in the kitchen while the rain came down outside, and neither of them said anything more about it. The pretrial meeting happened on a Wednesday at the end of April in Dowd's office, with Voss on one side of the table and Dowd and Naomi on the other. Silas sat in the corner, same posture as Millfield, present and available, and saying very little. Voss was a trim city man who wore his suit like a statement, and looked at Naomi with the particular expression of someone who had been told she was a problem and had not yet decided how seriously to take it. Dowd presented the survey evidence. Voss listened with polite attention and questioned the certification process, at which point Naomi produced Adler's signed statement describing the legitimate certification. Voss accepted it with the controlled neutrality of a man adjusting. Then Dowd mentioned Croft. Voss's controlled neutrality flickered. Just once, just for a second, but she saw it. "The assistant surveyor from the original survey," Dowd said. "He has retained his personal field notebooks from 1871, in which the water access notation is recorded in his hand. He is prepared to testify to the accuracy of those records and to the intent behind the notation." Voss said carefully, "I was not aware there was a surviving assistant surveyor." "He's been in Faro for 20 years, Naomi said. "He's not difficult to find if you look for him." Voss looked at her directly for the first time in the meeting. She looked back. He requested a recess. Dowd gave him 10 minutes in the outer office. When Voss came back, he said that his clients might be open to a settlement discussion contingent on certain conditions. Dowd said that his client was not interested in settlement. Voss said that this seemed like an unnecessarily difficult position. Dowd said that his client's position was that the claim against the Mercer water rights was fraudulent, and that the appropriate outcome was its dismissal with prejudice and a formal inquiry into the Crestfield Trust's other activities in the county. Voss was quiet for a moment. "That's an ambitious position." "We have 3 other ranchers prepared to present evidence of similar fraudulent claims," Dowd said, "all with consistent documentation and at least 2 with surviving witnesses." It was the first time Naomi had heard him say it out loud in a room with the other side present. She kept her face completely still. Voss looked at his papers. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. "I'll need to consult with my clients," he said. "Of course," Dowd said. "The trial date stands in the meantime." After Voss left, Dowd sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Silas stood up from the corner. Naomi began organizing her papers back into the leather folder. "He's going to go back to his clients and tell them this is bigger than they planned for," she said. "Yes," Dowd said. "And then they're going to decide whether it's worth continuing or whether the exposure of pursuing it is worse than walking away." "Also, yes." She fastened the folder. "What do you think they'll decide?" Dowd was quiet for a long moment. "I think that depends on what Edwin Bart tells them to do. And I think Bart is going to look at the situation and realize that he built something he can't control anymore." She picked up the folder. "Good," she said, and meant it. She walked out into the April afternoon with the rain 2 days gone and the street of Red Hollow smelling like wet earth and new season. And she stood for a moment on the boardwalk outside Dowd's office, thinking about the fact that 7 months ago she had stood on this street with a suitcase and no plan and let herself shake for 20 minutes in a locked room at Mrs. Holt's. She was not shaking now. She was not done yet either. The trial was still 3 weeks away and Croft still needed to arrive. And there were documents yet to be organized and witnesses to prepare, and an entire web of fraud still to be formally unraveled in front of a county judge. She was not done. But standing on the boardwalk in the April light, with the leather folder under her arm and the knowledge of everything it contained, she felt something that was close enough to certain that she decided to let herself have it for a moment. She had found the shape of this thing. She had traced it from one end to the other. She knew what it was, and who was behind it, and how to prove it. And she had built, out of $43 in a locked room, and 2 years of hard work, and a 71-year-old man in Faro with a box of field notebooks, something that was going to hold up. She was going to make it hold up. She walked to the horse, mounted, and started east toward the ranch, and the afternoon light came across the flat land at a low angle that made everything look, briefly, like it had been there forever and intended to stay. Elias Croft arrived in Red Hollow on a Tuesday, 8 days before the trial, on the afternoon stage from Millfield. Naomi was there to meet him because she had been tracking the stage schedule for a week and because she needed to see for herself that he had actually come. Old men made promises in warm front rooms with coffee in their hands, and then reconsidered when the traveling became real. She had prepared herself for that possibility. He stepped down from the stage slowly, with the careful negotiation of a man who had learned to distrust the distance between a step and the ground, and he was carrying a leather bag in one hand and a flat wooden case under his other arm that she recognized immediately as the kind used to transport documents flat. He had brought the field notebooks in something protective. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. "Mr. Croft," she said. He looked at her. "Miss Calloway?" He looked at the town. "Smaller than I remembered." "You've been here before?" "Once, in 1871. It was hardly more than a trading post then." He looked at the main street with the expression of a man doing arithmetic between memory and present. "Changed some." She took him to Dowd's office first, because that was the practical order of things, and Dowd went through the legal structure of what would happen in court with the careful thoroughness she had come to trust in him. Croft listened, asked 3 precise questions, and said he understood. He was not nervous, or if he was, it lived somewhere below the surface where she couldn't see it. He had the settled quality of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was now close to setting it down. She had arranged for him to stay at Mrs. Holt's, which involved a conversation with Mrs. Holt that had been more civil than most of their exchanges, possibly because Naomi was paying for 2 weeks in advance. The room was the same one Naomi had stayed in the night after Edwin Bart had stood on Main Street and said what he said. She noticed that when she showed Croft to it, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the east-facing window, she felt something complicated about that particular room in a way she hadn't expected. The week before the trial had its own weather system. Voss made 2 more attempts to open settlement discussions. Dowd declined both. The Crestfield Trust's attorney was, Dowd told her, operating under instructions from clients who had not yet decided whether to pull back or push through, and that indecision was itself information. It meant they knew their position was weaker than they'd planned for. Edwin Bart was visible in Red Hollow during that week in a way he hadn't been for months. She saw him twice from a distance, talking to people outside the land office, talking to a man she didn't recognize near the hotel. He had the specific energy of someone who had set something in motion and was now watching it move in directions he hadn't calculated. She did not approach him. She had nothing to say to Edwin Bart that needed to be said before the trial. Cal asked her, 3 nights before the hearing, what was going to happen. They were in the office. She was reorganizing the document order for the 4th time, which she did when she was thinking, and he had come in on the pretext of finding a pencil and stayed, which was his habit when something was on his mind. "Best case," she said without looking up. "The judge dismisses the claim with prejudice and refers the Crestfield Trust's activities to the Territorial Authority for formal investigation. Aldous Webb and Ida Forsyth have their disputes reopened. Margaret Soul's husband gets something like posthumous vindication." "And worst case?" She looked up then. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. The old posture, the guarded one, though it meant something different now than it had in August. "We lose on a technicality and have to appeal," she said, "which would take time and money we'd rather spend on other things. But you don't think that's going to happen?" "No," she said. "I don't." He was quiet for a moment. "What about Bart?" She set down her pencil. "That depends on what the territorial investigation finds. If the trust is what I think it is, there will be people looking at how it was used and who directed it towards specific properties. Bart's January visit to this ranch is documented. I wrote it down the day it happened, date and time, and everything he said. Whether that's enough to matter legally, Dowd will know better than me." Cal absorbed this. "You wrote it down the day it happened," he repeated, not quite a question. "I write everything down the day it happens. It's a habit." He was quiet again. Then, "That's a good habit." "Yes," she said. "It is." She picked up her pencil. "Go to bed, Cal." He went, without argument, which was one of the reliable markers of how far things had come since August. She stayed in the office until midnight, going through the order of documents one final time, not because they needed it, but because it settled her mind to have everything in the right sequence. Outside, the May night was warm enough that the window was open and she could hear the ranch in its nighttime state, the distant sound of the livestock, the dry creak of the barn in the wind. She had learned the sounds of this place the way you learn the sounds of any place you lived in long enough, and she was aware, sitting in the office at midnight, that she had crossed some line between staying somewhere and belonging somewhere without noticing exactly when it happened. She was not the same woman who had sat in this county's only boarding house shaking in a locked room. That woman had been brave, she thought, in the specific way of someone who has no choice but to be brave. What she felt now was different. It was something she had built piece by piece, from the accounts ledger to the supply contracts to the leather folder to the field notebook in Croft's careful handwriting. You could build things, she thought, even from nothing, even when people looked at you and saw nothing worth building from. She closed the ledger, went to bed, slept better than she had expected. The trial began on a Thursday morning in the county courthouse, which was a wood-frame building that smelled like sawdust and old argument and had benches along the back wall that were full by 9 o'clock. She had not anticipated the audience. She should have. This was a small county and a significant dispute, and people had been talking about it for months. But the specific reality of walking into a room full of people who knew her name and had opinions about her face and were here to watch was different from anticipating it. She sat beside Dowd at the plaintiff's table with the leather folder in front of her and did not look at the benches. Silas sat directly behind her. She could feel that without turning around. Voss was at the opposing table, trim and composed, with 2 associates she didn't recognize who had driven up from the city. They had more paper than she expected, which meant they were planning something procedural, which Dowd had warned her about. The judge was a woman, the only female county judge in the territory, a fact Naomi had learned from Dowd and filed without comment. Her name was Judge Harriet Kane, and she was perhaps 60, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where economy was necessary. Voss opened by challenging the certification of the Millfield documents on procedural grounds. Dowd responded with Adler's signed statement and a secondary certification he had obtained from the territorial registrar. Kane sustained the documents. Voss noted his objection. They moved on. The survey evidence came in cleanly. Dowd walked through it methodically. The original survey, the field notation, the deed attachment language, the 1873 boundary amendment that cross-referenced the price survey by number, and thereby confirmed its standing. Naomi had organized everything in the order Dowd needed it, and he moved through the sequence without hesitation, and she tracked each document as it was entered and noted on her own copy when each one was accepted. Then Voss presented the Crestfield Trust's counterargument, which was approximately what Dowd had predicted. The 1878 amendment process had inadvertently voided the water access notation because the parcel had been flagged for potential resurvey. The flag, he argued, had legally suspended the deed attachment pending resurvey, and when the resurvey was never completed, the water access had reverted to the original territorial holding. It was, she had to admit, better constructed than she'd expected. There was a document, a county administrative record from 1878, that did show the Mercer Eastern parcel flagged for potential review. If you looked at only that document and the Crestfield claim, the argument had a superficial coherence. She wrote a note to Dowd. He read it, nodded once. When it was their turn to respond to the amendment argument, Dowd called Elias Croft. The old man walked to the witness chair with his wooden case under his arm and sat down with the careful deliberateness she had come to recognize, and the room was, for a moment, specifically quiet. People on the benches leaned forward. She heard someone behind her exhale. Dowd walked Croft through his credentials, the years with Price, the specific surveys he had worked on, his role in the 1871 Red Hollow parcel group. Croft answered in a clear, even voice that carried without effort. He opened his wooden case and produced the 1871 field notebook and the copy he had made 10 years ago, and he explained, in language precise enough for the legal record and plain enough for the benches, exactly what the water access notation said and why it said it and what it meant for the deed attachment. Then Dowd asked about the 1878 parcel flag. The flag for potential review, Croft said, was a standard administrative notation applied to a broad category of parcels that might be affected by the boundary amendment process. It was not a suspension of existing deed attachments. It was a question mark, a note to be resolved. Under the territorial guidelines in effect in 1878, a potential review flag had no legal effect on existing recorded attachments until a resurvey was actually commissioned and completed. He looked at the judge, not at Voss. No resurvey was commissioned for the Mercer Eastern parcel. The flag was never resolved. The deed attachment therefore remained in full effect. Voss rose for cross-examination. He was controlled, but she could see from where she sat that he was working against something. He challenged Croft's memory of events 45 years prior. Croft produced the field notebook. He challenged the interpretation of the territorial guidelines. Croft cited the specific provision number. He challenged whether Croft had any formal authority to interpret administrative procedure. Croft said, mildly, that he had worked within that administrative system for 12 years and was describing how it actually functioned rather than offering an interpretation. Voss sat down. Judge Kane looked at the field notebook for a long moment. She looked at the certified survey copies. She looked at the Crestfield Trust's founding documentation, which Dowd had entered into evidence along with its filing history. "I want to address the Harmon letter," she said. This had not been in the planned sequence. Naomi's pencil stopped moving. Dowd rose. "Your Honor, the 1878 letter from county land official Raymond Harmon to the territorial office querying whether the Red Hollow survey records were secured against amendment is entered as Exhibit 7. "I've read it," Kane said. She looked at Voss. "The Trust's founding documents show an initial capitalization structure that was registered in the city in 1879, the year following this letter." Voss said carefully, "The timing is coincidental?" Kane said. She did not say it aggressively. She said it the way you said a word when you wanted to give the other party the opportunity to confirm or deny it before you decided what to do with it. Voss said, "We would argue so, Your Honor." Connie set the letter down. "I'm going to hear from the additional witnesses before I rule on the primary claim." Aldous Webb testified for 20 minutes. He was a slow talker in ordinary life, but in the witness chair he was precise and complete, and he brought the documents Naomi had taken from his tin box, which Dowd had entered in advance. Ida Forsyth testified for 30 minutes and was not slow at all. She was direct in the way of someone who had been waiting 4 years to say something in a room where it had to be heard. She did not have original documents, but she had the name of the city attorney who had represented the opposing party in 1884, which was a different name than Voss, but a name that Dowd had discovered had worked for the same city firm. The same firm. When Dowd entered that connection into the record, she heard a sound from the benches behind her that was not quite a murmur, something collective and low. Voss requested a recess. Kane gave him 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, Naomi sat at the table and did not turn around and did not speak to anyone because she was doing the thing she always did when something was close to resolving. She was going through the entire sequence in her head, every document in order, every witness, every connection, looking for the gap she might have missed. She did not find one. She had not expected to find one, but she looked anyway, because that was how she had always operated, and it was one of the things about herself that she had stopped trying to apologize for. Silas put his hand on her shoulder, just briefly, just for a second, and then it was gone. She breathed. When Voss came back, he requested a conversation with the judge in chambers. Kane agreed. They were gone for 40 minutes. Naomi waited. Dowd waited. The people on the benches waited. Croft sat in the witness chair because nobody had told him he could leave it, and he sat there with his hands folded on the wooden case with the patience of a man who had been waiting 45 years and could manage another 40 minutes without difficulty. When Kane returned, Voss did not come back to his table. He sat in a chair against the wall near his associates, which was a different position, and she noted the position. Kane looked at her notes for a moment, then she looked up. The claim filed by the Crestfield Water and Land Trust against the water access rights of the Mercer Eastern parcel is dismissed with prejudice, she said. Her voice was level and it filled the room. The original 1871 survey notation, as confirmed by surviving field documentation and witness testimony, establishes the water access as a valid deed attachment that was not suspended or voided by the 1878 administrative flag. The claim is without merit. She paused. I am also referring the activities of the Crestfield Water and Land Trust to the Territorial Authority for formal investigation, on the basis of the pattern of conduct established through testimony and documentation presented today. The court notes the connection between the trust's legal representation across multiple disputes and requests that the Territorial Authority examine whether these disputes were part of a coordinated effort to defraud county landholders. The room behind Naomi came alive all at once. Not chaos, but a specific release of collective breath and movement that had been held in check for 3 hours. She heard Webb say something to someone near him. She heard Ida Forsythe laugh, a short, sharp sound like something breaking open. She looked at Dowd. He was writing something on his notepad. He glanced at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, smiled. She turned around. Silas was standing. He was looking at her with the expression she had cataloged without naming for months, the one that had been building from something simple in July to something considerably more complicated by May. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked past him at the room. The benches were full of faces she recognized. Mrs. Crane from the post office, who had said things at the beginning that Naomi had heard sideways and never acknowledged. Hector Greer's representative, who had the expression of a man calculating. The hardware store owner whose son had repeated Bart's forgery story at school. All of them now rearranged into something new by the last 40 minutes, and she looked at them and felt, not triumph exactly, something quieter and more permanent than triumph, something that had to do with having done the work and having it be enough. She looked for Edwin Bart. He was in the back corner near the door, and he was already moving toward it. She did not stop him. She did not need to. Outside the courthouse, on the steps, the afternoon had turned into something golden and May warm, and Croft found her while Dowd was talking to Webb and Forsythe and the small cluster of people who had gathered around them. "Well," Croft said. "Well," she said. He looked at the street. "I want to go home." "You can go home." He nodded. He was holding his wooden case under his arm. He looked, she thought, like a man who had recently put down something heavy, and the absence of the weight was so new he was still adjusting his posture around it. "You built a good case," he said. "You made it possible. Without your field notebook. Without your questions, I'd have died in Faro with a box of notebooks nobody ever asked about." He looked at her sideways. "Don't diminish what you did by being modest about it. It doesn't suit you." She looked at him. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose it doesn't." He took the afternoon stage back toward Millfield. She watched it leave and then turned back to the courthouse steps where Silas was waiting with his hat in his hand, that same gesture from July, the one she had learned meant he was thinking. And the difference between July and now was everything. What happened next was not dramatic. It was, in fact, almost ordinary, which was the part she had not expected. Edwin Bart did not come to find her afterward. He went home, and within 2 weeks of the trial, the story around town was that he had received a formal inquiry from the Territorial Authority regarding his connection to the Crestfield Trust and the timing of his approach to the Trust's representatives prior to the water rights claim. Whether that inquiry came to anything legal was something Dowd tracked and reported to her in practical terms. It was ongoing, it was serious, it would take time. She did not occupy herself with Edwin Bart's particular fate. She had understood, watching him move toward the courthouse door at the moment of dismissal, that his was a self-made diminishment and would continue diminishing without her assistance. The ranch was the more immediate reality. After the water rights were confirmed, the East Pasture operation entered summer in a way it hadn't in 3 years, with the creek access secure and the loan restructured and the supply contracts renegotiated. They brought in the first genuinely profitable cattle season since Silas's wife had died, which was not a dramatic number but was a real one, and she entered it in the ledger in her own hand, and Silas looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and she understood what the silence held. The changes at the ranch were not all financial. They were the slower kind, the kind you noticed in accumulation rather than in individual moments. Cal started keeping his own set of running accounts, not replacing hers, but parallel to them, which she found one evening and reviewed without comment. And when she saw that he had caught a small discrepancy in the supply delivery records that she herself had missed, she put a note on his page that said simply, "Good catch." He did not mention it. Neither did she. But she noticed that he started showing up in the office more frequently after that, asking questions that were less about testing her and more about actually wanting to know. Jesse grew 6 months older and 3 inches taller and developed an opinion about everything, which was not a change so much as an intensification of something that had always been there. He started talking about what he wanted to do when he was grown, and his ideas were large and inconsistent and changed every 2 weeks, which was exactly correct for a 13-year-old. And she listened to them all without pointing out the inconsistencies, because some things deserved to be outgrown naturally. The other ranchers came to her, not all at once. That would have been orderly, and people were not orderly. Aldous Webb came first, a few weeks after the trial, with a specific question about his own supply contracts that he had started wondering about after watching what she had done with Greer. She helped him. Ida Forsyth came next, with a more complicated situation involving a property boundary and some paperwork that had been improperly filed in 1880, and that one took 2 months of correspondence with the territorial office to resolve, but it resolved correctly. Others came intermittently over the following months, with varying degrees of embarrassment about needing help, and she helped them all because the problems were real, and she knew how to address them, and there was no reason not to. She did not advertise this. It was not a business. It was simply a thing that happened when you were known to be competent and the people around you had problems. The moment with Silas, the one she had been aware of approaching since sometime in the winter, did not happen in any way she had imagined or prepared for. It happened on an evening in late June, after supper, when the boys had gone out to do the last of the evening chores, and the kitchen was quiet, and she was washing the dishes because she was washing the dishes, and he was drying them because that was the arrangement they had developed without discussing it. He said, without looking up from the plate he was drying, "I'd like you to stay." She kept washing. "I am staying." "I mean," he stopped, started again. "I mean permanently, as my wife. I'm asking you to marry me, Naomi." She was quiet for a moment. The dish in her hands was one of the 4 matching ones, not the chipped cup, not the mismatched 5th piece, one of the solid set. "You're not asking because of the ranch," she said. "No." "Or because the boys are used to me?" "No." "Then why?" He set the plate down. He turned and looked at her directly in the way he did when he had decided something and was done being careful about it. "Because when you're not in the room, I notice it. Because you're the most capable person I've ever shared a life with, and I don't mean that like a compliment about your work. I mean," he stopped. The words were not easy for him, she knew. They never were. "I mean, I want to keep sharing it. All of it. And I think you know that already." She did know it. She had known it for a while, in the same way she knew things, by looking at the evidence and following it to its logical conclusion. What she hadn't known was whether knowing it meant she should do anything about it. She thought about the woman who had stood on Main Street in July with a suitcase and $43 and nowhere to go, and the specific decision not to fall. She thought about what she had built from that moment, not just the accounts and the contracts and the court case, but the other things. The room with the lock, the scratched knuckle that Jesse showed her like a badge, the 3 pages of Cal's handwriting in the ledger, the way Silas had put his hand on her shoulder for 1 second in the courthouse and then taken it away. She was not the same woman who had arrived in Red Hollow. She was not better in every particular. She was more tired in some ways and more certain in others, and she had opinions now about this ranch and this county and these people that she had not had in July, and opinions were weight, and weight changed the shape of you. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes? I'll marry you, Silas." She turned back to the dishes. "Don't make a speech about it." He laughed, a short, genuine sound that she had heard before but not often enough, and which she intended to hear more of. He picked up the plate again. They finished the dishes. They were married in September, in a ceremony in the front room of the ranch because neither of them wanted the production of a church wedding, and because the front room was where they actually lived, and that seemed right. Dowd came. Croft had sent a letter with his regrets and a gift of a county map from 1870 that he had made himself, framed, which she hung in the office. Aldous Webb came. Ida Forsyth came and brought a pie that was better than anything Naomi had produced in the ranch kitchen, which she acknowledged honestly. And Forsyth said, "You're not bad for a Missouri woman," and Naomi said, "You're not bad for someone who didn't bring the recipe," and they understood each other perfectly. Cal stood beside his father during the ceremony, which had not been arranged, He simply positioned himself there, and nobody moved him. Jesse stood beside Naomi, which also had not been arranged, and at one point during the brief ceremony he reached over and took her hand the way a child takes the hand of someone they have decided belongs to them, with no ceremony and no announcement and no suggestion that this required permission. She held his hand and did not look at him, because if she looked at him she was going to embarrass herself, and she had a public composure to maintain. The winter that followed was hard in the way winters were hard, and manageable in the way things were manageable when you went into them prepared. She kept the accounts. Silas ran the cattle operation. Cal continued his parallel ledger, and she continued not making a formal thing of it. Jesse grew another inch and changed his mind about the future 6 more times. The East Pasture ran its second successful season. The territorial investigation into the Crestfield Trust concluded in the spring. The trust was dissolved. 3 individuals connected to its operation, including Raymond Harmon's nephew, who had apparently been maintaining his uncle's old arrangements through a city intermediary, were referred to territorial court. Edwin Bart was fined and formally censured for his role in directing the trust's attention toward the Mercer property. He was not imprisoned, which Dowd said was consistent with what the evidence supported, and which she accepted without satisfaction or disappointment, because she had never required Edwin Bart's punishment to feel that something had been corrected. The correction was its own thing. It did not need him to suffer for it to be real. Aldous Webb had his 1882 settlement overturned. Ida Forsyth received a formal confirmation of her original water rights, and a county apology that Forsyth said was not worth the paper it was written on, but that she would frame anyway. Margaret Soule received a letter from the territorial authority acknowledging that her husband's original position had been correct. And when Naomi heard about that letter, she was quiet for a long time, thinking about a woman who had served her water without comment and said her husband had never stopped believing he'd been cheated. She wrote Margaret Soule a personal letter, not official, just a letter from one woman to another saying that he had been right and that it mattered that he had kept saying so. Soule wrote back. They corresponded for 2 years. What Naomi had learned, what she kept coming back to, in the quiet of the office, or the kitchen, or the early mornings before anyone else was up, was something she couldn't have told you in July because she hadn't known it yet. It was not about fighting. She had never been a fighter in the romantic sense. She had been an accountant, a seamstress, a keeper of records, a writer down of things that happened. The weapons she had used in every battle had been documentation and patience, and the willingness to look at complicated things until they became clear. What she had learned was that those things were enough. Not always. Not in every county or every situation or every year, but often enough. Often enough that they were worth being. She had arrived in Red Hollow with one suitcase and one particular skill, the ability to look at numbers and find the truth inside them. She had used it to stabilize a ranch, expose a fraud, protect a community, and build a life that fit her in a way that no correspondence for 7 months with a man in a jacket had ever promised. She had not planned any of it. She had made, at each point, the next right decision with the information available, and the decisions had accumulated into something she recognized, now, as hers. The ranch was hers. Not on paper. The paper said Mercer, and that was correct and right, but in the way that mattered, in the way that you earned a thing not by owning it, but by understanding it deeply and caring for it faithfully and being willing to stand in front of a county judge and prove it was worth protecting. She was sitting in the office one morning, the second spring, the one after everything had been settled, when Cal came in and sat across from her in the chair his father used and said, "I want to learn everything." She looked up. About what? Accounts, contracts, land records, the law. How much of it you can learn without being a lawyer? He said it with the flat certainty he'd had since she met him, the certainty that had been hostile once and was now just how he was. All of it. She studied him for a moment. He was 16 and looked like Silas in the jaw, and like someone she couldn't quite identify yet in the eyes, not his mother, not his father, something that was being worked out in him still. He was, she thought, going to be formidable. He already was, in the unpolished way of someone who didn't yet know the full shape of what they were. "All right," she said. She moved one of the account ledgers across the desk to him, opened to a fresh page, and they began. Outside, the May morning was doing what May mornings did in this part of the country, coming in clear and dry, with the particular smell of land that had gotten through another winter and was not ungrateful about it. The cattle in the east pasture were moving toward the creek, which ran clear and unbothered along the boundary line where it had always run, going nowhere particular and taking its time getting there. She was not thinking about Edwin Bart. She was not thinking about the courthouse or the Crestfield Trust or the long road from Missouri that had deposited her in Red Hollow on a July morning with the wrong amount of passage money and a life that needed to be entirely rebuilt. She was thinking about the column of numbers in front of her and the boy across the desk who was going to ask a good question in about 30 seconds, and the sound of the ranch in the morning, which she had learned the way she learned everything, by paying attention, by staying long enough, by refusing to leave before she understood what she was dealing with. The question came. She answered it. The morning continued. That was enough. It was, in fact, everything.